text them. No.
Good to see you.
Welcome back, everybody. I now recognize Ms. Becky Taylor to introduce our next topic and presenter. Ms. Taylor.
Thank you, Chairman Kobe. Today we are going to have the preliminary results report and presentation on the North Carolina Transformation Project. Just for a quick background on this, you know, during Race to the Top, we focused on our low performing schools, trying to turn around the schools, and of course I think we accomplished a lot and we had positive results, and Dr. Gary Henry of course was evaluating that at the time, but you know, we didn't fix everything, and each of us in this room would probably love to talk about our schools without having to mention schools that are low performing or students that are not proficient. And so we're going to keep digging into this endeavor, but we were real fortunate to get a grant a couple years ago after Race to the Top, and I believe we may have been one out of about 3 or 4 states that received this grant through the Department of Education. And once again, Dr. Henry and his team have stepped in and really been focusing on how effective our efforts have been. And as we know, if we could fix it today, it would have been fixed. So there are a lot of barriers that he's going to talk about, and you know, some things we can control and some things we cannot control, or either we can, you know, we can implement a few things to make it a little bit better. What we want to do today is take a look at the research, which he has. This is basically, this grant project was research-based, data analysis, and use this information as policymakers and of course our practitioners in the building as well as in our schools will take this information as well to help them in their teaching and learning. So I ask that you just listen with an open mind, ask questions as we go along. He's willing to let us stop him as he presents an item. So at this time I'm going to introduce Dr. Gary Henry and Miss Erica Harbacken. Is that right? Good.
Thank you very much, Ms. Taylor. I very much appreciate that that introduction and setting the context for this study. And it's great to be back with the board again today and have a chance to interact with you. As Ms. Taylor said, I'm happy to answer questions as we go along rather than trying to hold them to the end, because I think today what this really represents in the project is pivoting a bit. And we're going to pivot from talking about how the implementation was done to start talking about outcomes and what do we see in these schools that's happening as a result and of the transformation efforts that are it used to be under district and school transformation, now under educator support services, as that transition has been made. And so today we're going to talk about preliminary outcomes. We're going to look at outcomes over 3 years. We've got 2 years of data now, but it's time that we need to look to see what's going on in these schools. And I also want to be clear, by outcomes, we're definitely looking at student achievement gains, but there are other outcomes of interest, like teacher turnover, like principal turnover, and we've been looking carefully at those, and we believe those will provide some clues about why this has worked and why it hasn't worked, because these schools are really unique in this state that are a part of this transformation effort. So I also should recognize that we've got several members of the study team here with us today. I'm not going to call on them individually, but all I can say is each and every one of them has played an important part in preparing the data and the presentation today. And so I want to recognize and appreciate all of their efforts on behalf of this study. So just a little bit more context. The purpose of an NCT is North Carolina Transformation, and it's the transformation of the lowest performing schools in North Carolina. And the ultimate purpose here is to improve teaching and learning in those lowest performing schools and support continuous improvement in those schools with the services provided by DPI. We also have a very unique partnership here in that we're able to provide feedback to the staff that implement these policies on a continuous basis. And so far, we've had 3 sessions immediately after each semester. We gather the data, we compile it, we meet with Nancy Barber and her staff, and we talk through ways that their services might be improved based on the data that we've gathered. So that's a unique feature of this and one that we think has been very effective. But we're also here to evaluate the effectiveness of those services, and as I said before, that's kind of the transition that we're making today. You all might recall there's 75 schools receiving these services or who have received these services over the years. We visited 69 of those schools, many of them twice. We're out in the field visiting them again and gathering their impressions and about the services that have been delivered. We've done surveys in these schools. We've done interviews. We've met with district personnel in order to see and understand district policies in these schools. And so we're not just looking at quantitative data, although today we're going to really focus in on quantitative data. I know that's everybody's favorite, but I just want to come and make sure you get the data that you so want to hear about. So we've collaborated with DST and Education Support Services, their leadership, and we feel like we've got a great partnership with them. Today, we really want to focus attention on very specific barriers that we have found in these schools, such as teacher turnover, principal turnover, chronic absenteeism, the rate of novice teachers. And one of the points I want to make at the beginning, and I want to underscore throughout, that the high concentration of poverty gives rise to much higher rates of teacher turnover, principal turnover, chronic absenteeism, student mobility. So it's not as if we're going into these schools and they're just not handling those issues well. There's such a concentration of these issues in these schools that those must be addressed in order to turn these schools around and make them the kind of places we want for the students in North Carolina. So this is a little bit about the evaluation timeline. We started in 2016. The services began to be delivered. We were out in the field looking at the delivery of those services, and we've had briefings on the implementation, presentations to the state board throughout this process. And as Ms. Taylor mentioned to you, this is a competitive grant from the Institute for Education Sciences. 3 were given out in the country, and because of North Carolina and the recognition of the work done in North Carolina, back to Judge Manning, predating Race to the Top, there was such an enthusiasm among the reviewers that we were able to get this grant to move forward. So I think it's one of the places where North Carolina shines in the 50 states and is very well respected for the turnaround services and helping support these chronically low-performing schools. So we're going to come back to this in about slide 25, I think, today. But I just want to set the table by discussing these 4 issues that we think are policy-level issues that we hope that the board will begin to discuss and debate and think about how we can move forward. So, first of all, with respect to these underlying barriers, teacher and principal turnover, chronic absenteeism of students, what is the department's role? What's the state's board's role in addressing barriers to this improvement in the state's lowest performing schools? We'll show quantitative evidence today that says that these schools have continued to suffer from high levels of turnover, chronic absenteeism, and those are holding back the effective delivery of these services and really must be addressed. Although I can tell you, I've looked at almost every ESSA plan in the country, and there are very few, if any, that are actually addressing these barriers, even though there's evidence that these same kinds of things are happening in other states. So you're out in front on this as we begin these considerations. We also think it's important to think about how state supports for the improvement of these lowest performing schools should be modified to address barriers to improvement. And I'm going to talk about the state's current approach for delivering these services and the areas that may need to be incorporated into that to make them more effective in the future for these schools. One constant that has represented a very, very important part of turnaround efforts across the country where they've been successful is disruption of the status quo. That things have to change in these school buildings and you have to disrupt the status quo, but then you have to figure out some way to stabilize that environment and make it productive. So you all may recall under an earlier round of school improvement grants, there were 4 models, and those models, at least 3 of them required firing a number of staff or having them compete for their current jobs, hiring a new principal. Those aren't the only ways to disrupt the status quo. So it's not only through staffing changes, but other states have used guidelines for districts. In Tennessee, where we see very effective turnaround, they set a guideline that each of the districts had to implement a differentiated pay system to pay more for the principals and teachers who were highly effective to begin with, who would come and work in those schools. So that has not been a part of what North Carolina has traditionally done, but setting those guidelines may be an important consideration for you all to think about for these schools. So disruption of the status quo, the threat of state takeover in many states has proven to be a key and essential ingredient. Of course, that's happened in Halifax here, but in a different context and for different reasons. And finally, the 4th focal issue that we see is which schools and how many schools should be targeted under the Esso reform. As you all know, the Esso reforms call for services identifying the 5% of the lowest performing Title I schools in a state. And that in North Carolina is going to amount to about 70 to 80 schools, depending on as schools open and close. So we're going to be targeting those. Many states set tiers and differentiate services across those schools that are identified. One fact to point out to you, North Carolina was the only state of all the states receiving Race to the Top funds that delivered turnaround services to every one of the schools that were identified. You identified 116 schools. There's no other state in the country that approached that number during Race to the Top. It was very ambitious. And we also saw that the schools that improved the most had started out as the very lowest performing. So when we saw that growth, it was among those very lowest performing schools that were transformed the most. All the schools improved, but there was twice as much improvement in terms of proficiency scores in that lowest 2.5% compared to the next 2.5%. So a question moving forward, which schools should be targeted for services and what kind of services? You have some degree of control over those issues, even though they're federal requirements. And how many schools can be effectively improved given available resources. So there are a set of requirements in the federal mandates for $50,000 per school, $500,000 per district, and all of those are very important, but it may not be possible to deliver services effectively to 70 or 80 schools and make those kinds of changes in that many schools. When we did rough estimates from Race to the Top, we thought about 40 schools could be transformed. And that's another question that we invite the board to consider and think about as we move forward. So those are the policy issues, and now I'd like to go and begin to talk about some of the barriers that we see. In these schools that appear in that first column, in the year prior to receiving these services, so 14-15, 1/4 of the principals in these schools turned over. In the past 5 years, we have schools that have had 5 principals. And you can imagine that if one of the services is coaching principals so they become more effective, but the principal's not there the following year, it's going to be pretty hard to increase the effectiveness for that. Almost 1/3 of the teachers turned over in the year prior, and we're going to show you that that actually increased in the years after they started receiving these services. 1/3 of the teachers in these schools are in their first 3 years. We know that teachers, the greatest improvement that we see in their effectiveness is through the first 3 to 5 years. So these schools are hiring brand new teachers, and the teachers are largely gone after 3 years. So you can see if your novice teacher rate and your turnover rate you're losing 1/3 of your teachers on average, and you're trying to build them up over a number of years, they're not going to be there to be coached and improved from one year to the next to the next. In other transformation interventions across the country, we see a big stress on keeping these teachers and developing policies that will help retain these teachers. The student transfer rate, that means the number of students that were there when the tests were given that weren't there the first 2 weeks of schools, is about 20% in these schools. So those kids are coming in and out of these schools. It's stronger in the urban areas, but in many of these rural areas in which we're working, we see a high rates of transfer. And chronic absenteeism is another problem that, sorry, must have hit the wrong button, sorry. The chronic student absenteeism, and I want to distinguish this from teacher absenteeism. I know you all have heard a good bit about that lately, but this is students. We had a teacher in our advisory committee that said she counted the number of times her students were tardy. She teaches in one of these schools, and she said it made up about another 8 days of absences if you add up the tardies. The problem of parents coming and taking school students out early is epidemic. We can report back to you on some of the things we're finding from our qualitative work, but if they're not in school, they're undoubtedly not learning what they should be learning.
And if I might add this point, Dr. Henry, just the early dismissal and the late arrivals, you have to be in a school to see the disruption to the school.
Right.
Someone has to, write notes, you have to take the child down the hall. It's just so disruptive.
Yeah, it's a much larger problem than a single parent getting their child out early to go to a dentist doesn't seem like a problem. But when you're losing 5, 6, 10 students and you're disrupting that class, you're losing important instructional time. That's all there is to it. And those situations need to be addressed in addition to the full days of chronic absenteeism. So right now, and I realize you've seen a lot of charts and graphs today, and I apologize for bringing you yet one more. But what we have here on the left side in the green box are the intervention components that were delivered to these schools. So the common components, the schools developed a school improvement plan. They're doing that through NC STAR. There's a high degree of praise for NC STAR among these. It's an automated system that they're using. They're developing their plans, and they're continuously updating those plans. Each of these schools was scheduled to receive a comprehensive needs assessment. Then the folks from now ESS that do the comprehensive needs assessment, they go back and they work through those results with the schools. Often the school improvement plan is modified. There's district coaching. We can tell you some pretty specific stories about how districts can undermine some of the activities that these schools need to undertake in order to improve. And then there's professional development in the school. That comes in the form of standardized professional development, but a tremendous amount of coaching for school transformation coaching for the principals and instructional coaching for the teachers, especially those that the data show and the principal agree are most in need of receiving those services. So that's the intervention model. And as we talked about earlier, nothing specifically yet addressing issues of teacher turnover, of principal turnover, chronic absenteeism, and the like. So we're going to look at the preliminary outcomes today first descriptively, and we're going to compare the 75 schools served by DST with the 85 schools that were the next lowest performing. So what we would expect is if these services are really taking hold at this point, after only 2 years, we would expect to see higher increases in the DST schools than the comparison schools. So here we show you a chart, and each of these lines represents, the vertical lines represents a school, and the NCT schools are coded blue, and they're above the 0 line if they surpass the state average, and they're below the 0 line if they did not make the same growth in performance composite as all schools on average. That growth was 2.2%. So you see that 60%, or 45 out of 75 of the NCT schools outperformed the state proficiency growth rates. So that's a very positive result, especially when you consider that these 75 schools on average in the previous 5 years were declining. And so we've got the beginning of NCT, and after NCT services were begun, these schools began to improve their performance. So it was about 5 points on the performance composite. However, we see that those 85 schools that were most similar increased by about 6 2/3 points on the performance composite. So their growth slightly surpassed the growth that we see in the NCT schools, and this is in terms of performance composite. When we break that down by level, this is a very interesting finding to us, because we see that the high schools, there were 12 high schools in NCT, and their growth rate was very positive, so 5.6 points on the performance composite compared to 3.6 points for the high schools that were most similar to them in the state. We saw this under Race to the Top. We saw it back to the original call when Judge Manning identified 33 schools as committing academic genocide. We've seen higher growth rates in the high schools than we have in the elementary or middle schools. And in elementary schools in particular, we see that the comparison schools grew by 8 points, while the NCT schools grew by about 4 points. So one of the things that we need to think about a bit in this context is, how do the services perhaps need to be different in elementary schools in order to bring those up? But I would also say that the fact that we only have 3 tests, end of course tests, for the high school. So we only have to really have 3, 4, 5 very effective teachers in the high schools to raise these scores. It's possible that it's much easier to raise the scores on those 3 remaining tests than it is to raise all reading and math and science scores in 5th and 8th grade. So I want to give a little nuance to this. It may be just more difficult in the elementary schools where we have the reading and math as well as science scores, and we need teachers to teach those in all grades 3 through 5 and 6 through 8. So our preliminary outcomes show that when we look at the comparison for 2016, which was the services began to be delivered in January 2016. So in the middle of that year, we saw no difference between the outcomes in the NCT schools and the other schools. In 2017, we saw, in terms of growth from that baseline year, less growth in the NCT schools than the comparison schools. So that's telling us we need to focus in and really understand what's going on in those schools. We looked at value added. The growth patterns were very similar in terms of EVA scores. In graduation rates, there appeared to be a dip, but it was not significantly different. A part of that, as you saw, we just have 12 high schools in the study. And that, of course, reduces our ability to find statistical significance. Here's what we think is a really important set of facts to note with regard to the NCT schools. In 2016, we see a higher rate of principal turnover. So the first year, if you remember, the legislature changed the definition of low-performing schools, and they began to include schools that had met growth, where before those schools were excluded from the low-performing. And so there were many more of these schools that lost their principals than those comparison schools in 2016. In 2017, there was no difference among the principal turnover, but the teachers, there was much higher teacher turnover rate in the year following, and that is something we see a lot. When a principal turns over one year, you often see teachers, and some of the best teachers leave the following year because they go to seek a principal whose management style or the way of operating the school climate is more compatible with what they want to do. So it is a little bit of an oversimplification, but not much to say principal turnover in one year begats high rates of teacher turnover the following year. So Erica's going to talk a little bit about these barriers and about the consequences to students.
Okay, so we're going to bring in some other research and think about where these barriers start to affect student outcomes. And Gary's alluded to a lot of this already. But in that first year of NCT, nearly half of the schools lost their principals. And some of those happened within the school year. So most of those happened between school years at the end of that first year. But 13% of these schools lost their principals sometime between September and May. And we know that principal turnover has a direct effect on student achievement, in addition to having these kind of indirect effects through things like teacher turnover, through things like student chronic absenteeism. In terms of a direct effect, we know from other research that within-year turnovers are associated with about a 1 point decrease on the performance composite. And for between year, it's about half of that. In terms of teacher turnover, you saw in that kind of earlier slide that about a third of NCT schools lose their teachers each year. A third of teachers in NCT schools turn over each year. So if the average school loses about 10 of its 30 teachers, then in years when there's a within-year principal transition, that number is going to be 11 or 12. So that's where you see this kind of direct effect from principal turnover to teacher turnover. And about 8% of NCT teachers turned over during the school year. And in terms of student achievement, we know from other research that a student whose teacher turns over during the school year is expected to lose about 18.5% of an average student's growth. So they're going to grow by almost 20% less than an average student. So you're seeing these direct effects of these turnovers on student achievement. So thinking about this in terms of that theory of action, the model that Gary showed earlier, some of the things we looked at were whether schools that got more coaching might have seen better outcomes or might have seen more growth, and we didn't find that more coaching led to more growth. We do know that this is a tailored intervention, so we know that the DST and now ESS provides coaching based on what the school's needs are, so we might not expect to see more coaching turn into more growth. But in terms of fidelity of implementation, so the extent to which that model was implemented as delivered, we also didn't find that the schools that had a higher level of fidelity of implementation, schools that had an intervention that matched that theory of action more closely, saw more growth either. So what we're seeing is even in cases where you have really good coaching in the schools, and that's what we hear when we go out into these schools and we talk to teachers, the teachers who got the coaching say that they love the coaching that they got. But this model doesn't seem to be doing, on its own, doing what it needs to do in order to turn around these schools at the school level, even though it's definitely helping the teachers. So thinking about some of these other barriers, I'm going to dig into this a little bit on the next slides, but we looked at teacher turnover, student chronic absenteeism, and principal turnovers as potential barriers to improvement. And we'll look at what these look like and how these affect outcomes in schools like NCT schools. So we're going to drill down to just those NCT and comparison schools, these 160 low-performing schools. So what we find is that in these 160 low-performing schools, both treatment and comparison, students in schools where less than 15% of teachers turnover, that ends up being the median amount of turnover in these schools, gain nearly 2% of a standard deviation more than students in the average low-performing school. So that ends up being about 5% of an average student's growth. In terms of student chronic absenteeism, we see that students in schools where fewer than 6% of students are chronically absent. So thinking about the way that chronic absenteeism can kind of disrupt the whole school in addition to that individual student, schools where there's less of that, students gained about 3% of a standard deviation more than students in average low-performing schools. And that translates into about 7.5% of the average student's growth in these schools. And finally, thinking about principal turnover, thinking about the way that these schools tend to operate. We know that principals turn over. We know that across the country, about 1 in 5 principals turns over each year. And it ends up being higher in low-performing schools. It ends up being higher in high-minority schools. We're not going to keep principals for many, many years at all. But if we can keep principals for just a few years, so what happens if you keep principals for at least 3 years in the same school and you don't have that level of disruption every year at the end of the year or during the year? That's associated with a nearly 2% increase in student test score gains in these schools. So again, that's about 5% of a student's growth, the average student's growth in these schools. Yeah?
Is there a difference between rural versus urban turnover of principals and teachers?
In terms of how often it happens?
Yes.
Yes, so I don't have those exact numbers, but we can look back at that.
The 75 schools where they, you said, I forgot it, the urban versus rural.
These are largely rural because it excluded the Big Ten districts.
All right, thank you.
So they're almost exclusively rural. So thinking about how these barriers to improvement actually did affect student achievement growth under NCT, what we did was we started by clustering schools into groups based on these barriers to improvement, based on their values at baseline, so when they were assigned to get NCT services. And we did this based on a bunch of different variables, but the ones that we're going to focus on here are novice teacher percentage, the end-of-year teacher mover rate. So these aren't teachers who are leaving the profession. These are teachers who are moving to another school. And by and large, we see that teachers who move to another school tend to move to higher performing schools. Student absences, average principal supplement, and the student transfer rate. This is going to be the non-structural transfers into the school. And what you find is that these 5 groups have tend to have one single defining characteristic. So this y-axis is the percentile rank across all schools in North Carolina. It's not the percentage. So for example, if you look at group 1, that red bar, the second bar, represents the end of year teacher mover rate. And that means that most schools in this group of 13 schools is above the 90th percentile in terms of the end of year teacher mover rate. So this group 1 group has very high teacher mobility, whereas group 2 has very high novice teacher percentage. Group 3, you can see that most of those bars kind of are wider. So that's the 25th to 75th percentile in the group, which means that there's a lot more variation and they don't tend to have quite as many underlying kind of challenges as some of the other groups. Group 4, you see that has a very high student absences, and these are largely high schools. These are just the 75 treatment schools. And group 5, you see there's not a clear kind of single underlying barrier here, but they tend to have very high student transfer rates, and they also tend to be high on novice teacher percentage or end of year teacher mover rate, but there's a little bit more variation. And when we look at the outcomes and we look at the growth by these groups, based on these groups, what we find is that group 3 with the fewest underlying challenges, the fewest barriers to improvement, saw the highest growth. And that group 1, the one with the highest teacher mobility, saw the lowest growth. And that's where we're really seeing that these barriers to improvement are making it hard to change and transform these schools with just this piece of the intervention. So looking ahead and looking at the schools that are targeted right now, the 32 schools that are targeted by the Educator Support Services team, we tried to do the same thing. And what you're going to see is that this looks a lot different from the previous graphs, right? There's not one single challenge that each of these groups is facing. In this case, it tends to be that there's one thing that isn't quite as high as the others. So for example, if you look at group 1, they're high on OSS's out-of-school suspension, they're high on novice teacher rate, they're high on teacher turnover, and they're high on student mobility. The only thing that they're not quite as high on in that case is chronic absenteeism. Whereas if you look at group 2, you can see that they're high on 4 of the 5 again. The only thing they're not quite as high on is novice teachers, even though they have very high teacher turnover. So these might be the schools that are filling a lot of their slots with temporary retired teachers. Group 3, you see they're basically high on everything. The only thing they don't see quite as much of is the within year student transfer rate. And when we talked to our teacher and principal advisory committee, what we found was they really kind of focused on this graph. And they all looked at group 3 and they said, this is exactly the challenges that we face in our schools every day. This is my school. This group 3 looks like our school. We have to struggle with, we have a lot of out-of-school suspensions, we have a lot of novice teachers, we have a lot of chronic absenteeism, teacher turnover, within year student transfer rates in some cases. So this kind of really spoke to the challenges that they were facing. But the one thing I want to highlight about all of these is all of these schools in this group of 32 have very high teacher mobility. And that is that yellow bar, the teacher turnover bar. And since what we saw in the previous slide is that those schools with the high teacher mobility had the lowest growth, you can see that these underlying challenges are really going to come into play, especially as you're focusing in on these especially low-performing schools. And I'm going to turn it back to Gary to summarize.
Thank you. So just to make the point again and state once again what Erica has just commented on, the high teacher turnover rate, but these multiple barriers. So when Erica was talking about those rates at which each of these individual barriers reduce, we see that these schools don't have 1, they have 4 or 5. And that's why these problems are compounded in these schools and why it is so difficult to make a permanent improvement in terms of the students' outcomes in each of these schools. So in summary, we saw that the NCT schools did increase their proficiency rates by about 5 points, and the comparison schools increased their rates by about 6 2/3 points. The NCT schools made similar student achievement growth in 2016, but less in the second year of receiving those services. And the NCT principals were much more likely to turn over in 2016 And then in 2017, we see the high rates of teacher turnover. NCT schools lost 45% of their principals in their first year. And I want to underscore the difference between what we think of as end of the year turnover. If we think about schools traditionally, you think about teachers, they serve their contract, they end the school year, and they move perhaps over the course of the summer to a new school. That is not the case now in these schools. These schools are losing teachers in September, October, November. One of the highest rates of this loss comes from out-of-state teachers. We hire a huge number of teachers in North Carolina from out of state, and when they get a job offer back in their state, that's what most of them were looking for, and they often move back mid-year into those positions. So we become, in essence, a farm squad for the states that are exporting teachers to us: New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Virginia. Send them here for a couple of months or a couple of years, but then the dominant pattern is they move right back. So these are also characteristic. It was interesting to us. Teach for America almost never leave during the school year, almost zero. They only stay 2 to 3 years, but they never leave at the time that's most harmful for these students, whereas other alternative entry teachers tend to leave at much higher rates within the school. So we know something about the characteristics of these teachers, but the question is, how do we get the teachers who will stay to work in these schools? And that's a huge question that the country is going to have to face, because these schools aren't going to change without changing that teacher turnover pattern. So the within-year teacher turnover appears to have suppressed the achievement growth in the NCT schools. It also appears to have suppressed the student chronic absenteeism is also a problem that's suppressing those growth rates. And these three underlying barriers to growth are really things that, from a policy perspective, we've got to focus attention on if we really expect these schools to have reasonable proficiency rates for their students. And finally, as we narrow down the focus, in the level 3, there are 32 of these level 3 schools that are currently being serviced by ESS. They have those multiple, because they picked the very lowest performing of the schools out there. They have multiple barriers, and the effects of one barrier compound on the effects of the students and the other barriers themselves. So I come back to these implications for legislation, policy, and practice. The underlying barriers, traditionally, North Carolina policy has not focused on reducing these underlying barriers. So one question for you all to consider is, what is the role of the state, the department, the state board, in reducing these barriers to improvement in these schools? And Ms. Taylor, I don't know, we talked about whether we want to open up for after each of these for a few questions and comments, or we want to move through them all, but I'll be happy to do whichever you like at this point.
Is anybody ready to offer some thoughts on any of these, or do you want him to continue on? Okay, I figured we'd have lots of discussion. I know we're going to have to be careful of our time. Dr. Oxendine and then Ms. Willoughby.
Yeah, I think you have identified problems that the schools, the students face, the schools face. But you know what? I think it seems like before we can begin thinking about policy and developing policy and approving policy, I would need a little bit more information about what's beneath what we're calling a barrier. Because I think the barrier is somewhere underneath teacher turnover.
Right.
or it's what's causing these principals to leave. We can speculate some of the reasons. Some of them are out of the control of policy. The local school superintendent says, hey, you're going to go across the county next year. So I don't know that maybe we can control that through policy. I just think we need to know a little bit, we need to dive deeper.
Ms. Willoughby, and then,
Go ahead, Mr.
oh, Ms. Capper, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, to Dr. Oxendine's point, I believe it was Tom Tomberlin who brought us data on principal turnover and teacher turnover and the reasons behind that they give from exit surveys and things like that. So
Right.
that's data that we here at the department here has.
Right.
And that's something, we could easily pull
Add
up
to.
and look and add
Right.
to this context.
One of the things that I think would be important is we very much consider these intra-district transfers as really self-inflicted wounds. When a district is moving a principal or a teacher mid-year, they're almost, by definition, causing detrimental impacts on the school that teacher is removed from or that principal is removed from. So a part of this may be policy, but a part of it may be the district's understanding fully the implications of their actions when they're moving these. We see a lot of intra-district transfers of principals. That tends to happen in September and October at higher rates, and we see a high rate of intra-district transfers of teachers. That happens throughout the year in almost even amounts. About 1% of the teachers are transferred intra-districtly, if that's a word, each year. So 1% of the teachers are moving schools, and we know that harms the relationship as well as the instructional quality in the classroom where they had learned to work with a group of students and now are working with different ones.
Right. Ms. Willoughby, do you want to?
Well, it sort of segues into what I was going to ask. So are you saying that 1% of the teachers are moved by the district, intra-district,
Yes, in North Carolina, yes.
and the rest of the teachers who are leaving these low-performing schools, and you gave us the statistics at the beginning of this, are you, and I guess I don't remember when you started the study, but we've just administered the teacher working conditions survey. So when you get those results, will you be able to give us some more information?
I can already do that. That we know that when teachers rate their principals' leadership high, when they rate the distributed leadership high, and when they rate their resources and facilities as adequate, they're less likely to move, and they're much less likely to move during the school year. Those are the three pieces of the teacher working conditions that relate to this
Have
turnover.
been consistent year in, year out when we've
No news.
administered the survey.
But we just reanalyzed the data, and it's still the same.
Yeah, and I feel like everybody else is thinking, all of this is common sense, it makes sense. But you know what, I don't think we're addressing it. I'm not sure if we're addressing it, at the local level, and then of course here, and our legislators, this is a domino effect. It just goes from student to teacher to principal, student, and it's down, down, down. Ms. White?
One thing that's maybe suggested in those barriers but not articulated is the teacher vacancy rate at the schools. So positions within a school setting that remain vacant because the principal's inability to hire, and that impact on consistent, continual substitute teachers, and it's in overall impact on student achievement. So I would add that to the mix. And I think the question, I think the easy answer that some would propagate would be, hey, it's a paycheck, let's just pay them more. But that's not the easiest be all end all. So what other variables are we in control of that could could improve the conditions and make the turnaround. And that's sort of the root of the discussion.
So we've seen, thank you for that comment, Ms. White, and we've seen across the country that there are two things that have gone on, and each of the schools that are funded under Esso for this will be required to implement at least one evidence-based strategy. One of those strategies appears to be developing a marketing and recruitment effort. Principals and superintendents have largely relied on graduates of a local of their whatever the college or universities in their area that provide them with teachers. They reach out to those places, they recruit their teachers, and that's the way they come in. Other places, in Memphis is an area that I'm very familiar with. They got together, foundations and the school system support this great marketing effort for Memphis. Memphis has the highest murder rate in the country. You would think it would be really hard to recruit teachers into Memphis, but they put the effort together. They advertise for charters, for public schools. But they all come together and they recruit, put out a substantial effort. No single one of these districts can go and recruit out of state. But if the resources are pooled, you have an opportunity to recruit teachers at a whole different rate. And now they're applying online. I've reviewed the applications, and we've done a lot of analysis on this. And I would estimate they're getting 50% more teachers from more than 500 miles away than they could have gotten without this kind of effort, with all schools working together to bring strong educators. And the other is that, as Erica alluded to, these teachers are by and large not leaving the profession, so they want to be teachers. But there's a natural attraction to teach in easier schools. So the schools with less poverty, with less concentrations of the kind of students that are often difficult to engage, there's a natural attraction into those schools. And the only way that I've seen evidence, and there may be other out there, is differentiated pay in these schools compared to the other schools in the districts. And unless that where it's been effective, they do signing bonuses, but it's not for everybody. It's for teachers scoring 4 and 5. They do retention bonuses for teachers who continue to score at the top of the evaluation system. And so they build a combination of performance and pay together that works inside the district to offset that natural flow to the less challenging school environments.
Right, Ms. Willoughby?
Well, your comment about Memphis murder rate notwithstanding, when we talk about trying to, these are rural schools.
Yeah.
And that's a really different kind of recruitment from even Memphis, which in spite of that rate, there are a lot of other benefits to being in an urban area like Memphis. I think one solution we need to maybe re-energize is the notion of growing your own. I mean, we had some great programs at East Carolina for a long time, and you know that, Ms. Taylor, that
Yep.
If you want a teacher who wants to teach in Tyrrell County, you better find somebody who's already there, and especially if you want to retain them. And we've partnered with community colleges. We've done a lot of creative things, but maybe we just need a renewed commitment and effort around some of those things that we've done before, because I doubt we'll get people applying from 500 miles away to go to some of our like some of these very districts and schools.
Agree.
Yes, Mr. Alcorn, and then we need to move along, correct?
Couple years. We need to wrap this up in about
Okay.
10 minutes, so.
10 minutes.
But go ahead. Go ahead.
A couple years ago, we heard the Dr. Wayne Foster's proficiency study that said it took, if you were 50% or less proficient in your grade, it takes 2 years to catch up. Is this program you're showing us year over year is one of the things to look at for this is to be more realistic and say it's really a 4 years. You shouldn't really even look at your improvements over year, because the product that we're dealing with, the students are just inherently are less proficient at that point.
So we can see meaningful growth in the first year in a turnaround program that's well designed and that's really confronting a lot of these barriers. In North Carolina, in Tennessee, the only place that I know we've seen 5 years of sustained growth is in the I-zones in Tennessee. And we're about to release those data now, but it's the only one that's been looked at for 5 solid years. And the I-zones have continued to grow in Memphis, in Chattanooga, and Nashville over 5 years. But you can pick it up in the first year, but it's just not going to be a large jump.
Okay, Dr. Henry, you want to run through kind of the final?
So the second, and we'll end, is the state supports and how can we support these schools. What needs to be added to that theory of action to confront these barriers. The disruption of the status quo. Again, one of the things that's been used in many states that have shown positive outcomes, Massachusetts, Connecticut, several other states, is state guidelines for what districts are required to do in order to confront these barriers. Is an approach that's been used, and the threat of state takeover seems to be important. Finally, which schools should be targeted and how many schools can be effectively improved given available resources. And our calculations have been in the past, that number is somewhere around 40. You've got 32 Tier 3 service schools right now. It is probably going to spread the resources available from Title I too thin to think that 75 schools or about that number can be effectively served. So it's a trade-off between serving lots of schools but doing them with a lighter touch, or serving fewer schools with more resources. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Henry and Erica and your team. We certainly appreciate this information. I do think this is information that our practitioners probably sort of know, but seeing it, the hard data, and I do think y'all did a great job up to this point so far. So I expect even more good things from you regarding research and data, so that we can make some good decisions moving forward. So thank you very much. And I believe Dr. Barber is going to provide a response. You want me to move into that next?
Yes, go ahead.
And so now I'm going to ask that Dr. Nancy Barber come up. She's going to provide a response to this presentation and talk about the great things that you're doing, even though we feel like there's a lot of barriers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Taylor. Let me just start off by saying that we appreciate the work and the partnership that we've had through the NCT grant. And one of the most powerful things for us is to get these data and be able to process them and think about how we can improve. And while we recognize that there are barriers in school systems and districts, we're not going to take that as an excuse to not help and improve those schools. So we really do embrace this data. It was a hard pill to swallow because we wanted to hear all the wonderful things, but we learn more from our challenges, and so we're embracing this as a challenge. And what we want to talk to you about right now is sort of a logic model that we've developed, not only based on the information that Dr. Henry and his team have shared with us, but also I want to remind everyone that we've transitioned this year from what used to be district and school transformation into educator support services. And so we just kind of want to revisit that for a minute and how our work is changing. So what you have in front of you, we're going to really dive deep into in our next hour together, and we're going to get you involved in some of that work. And so what I want to start off with is just to really talk to you a little bit about what our next hour will look like in our agenda. We just want to make sure that we're aligning our work with your goals and your mission, and then also remind you of the Educator Support Services goals, and then talk to you a little bit about the outcomes that we're holding ourselves accountable for. And then the bulk of the work is really going to be about 2 draft documents, one that you see in front of you, which is a logic model that we want to talk to you about and get your feedback on. But then we really want to dive into what your reform model policy does for helping some of these schools that we've identified as recurring low performing. Because in addition to all the data we've learned from our NCT partnership, we also know that we have schools that are chronically on the low performing list, and that we really need to look at those schools and upset that status quo, that we can't allow those schools to continue to be low performing over a period of time. And we want to get your input on some of the work that we hope has aligned the feedback we've gotten from Ernst & Young, which has been what you heard earlier, as well as this data as we're moving forward and talking about transformation. And then have some general questions and answers at the end of that time. So just wanted to, again, remind you that we are focused on your vision and mission, and we do take into account when we're thinking about our continuous improvement what your goals are for our work. And we concentrate on those lowest performing schools. They're the hardest ones with the most barriers, but we feel like they're sort of our commitment is to those schools, and we feel like that aligns with your goals as well. And so we just want to make sure that our logic model and the work that we want to do moving forward makes sense to you and does align with your policies that are in place. And then we want to remind you of our purpose. And we do feel like in Educator Support Services that we provide a continuum of services to low-performing schools. But we also support that statewide system of support to all schools. Because if you'll remember, in our bottom level or level 1 services, we also support Teacher of the Year, Principal of the Year, the Milken Awards, and all of those services that are available to all schools. And when we talk about the lowest performing schools, that's our level 3 service. And when Dr. Henry talked earlier about the number 40 and 40 plus, that was under the district and school transformation resources. And when we combined, those level 3 services don't have the number of people because we're serving in level 2 at a district regional service, and then we also have our work at level 1. So when we're thinking about the numbers of schools that we can support, we just want to keep in mind the resources that we currently have, and that our outcomes are aligned with improving student achievement. Ultimately, our work is successful when we align and improve student achievement. We align our work. And when we talk about alignment, one of the things that Ernst & Young has pointed out in the silo work is we really do take this on as a collaborative effort. It's not just Educator Support Services providing supports to those lowest performing schools. We collaborate and want to work with federal programs and accountability and all of the academic services. So really when the feedback from Ernst & Young came about breaking down these silos, that's exactly what we're trying to do with this work, and just appreciate their feedback. And really, they did a deep dive into what breaking those silos might look like, and I feel like we're on our way to doing that, particularly in our district work. But we know we have a lot of work to do moving forward, but we are really dedicated and committed to making sure that it's a collaborative effort across several of the areas of work in the department right now and moving forward with whatever that looks like. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Petrie Martin now, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about the guiding principles behind this work. Then we'll dive into the logic model you have in front of you, and then we have a flow chart that we're going to break into small groups. That's what the chairs are for. So we'll give you some guidance with that in just a few minutes.
So thank you, and Dr. Barber has done an excellent job in describing how we have arrived at this point. So last November, at our November planning meeting, I stood before you and I talked about the fact that we were unveiling the new Educator Support Services. At that time, I also talked to you about collective impact, which was an area of research that all of the academic areas were going to study in an attempt to break down those silos. And then I also shared with you that we were looking at John Cotter's work on the 8 steps of leading change, which is at the heart of change management. So we truly have started this work a few months ago of knowing we needed to break down those silos, and this is certainly an example of that. So what you're going to see today are 6 guiding principles that really have driven the draft documents that you see before you today. Just know that the Innovative School District staff, Educator Support Services, the 10 academic areas, and federal program and monitoring have all been a part of this discussion that we're about to have with you. Of these 6 guiding principles for this work, the first is the use of data. One of the Ernst & Young recommendations is that we need to have a repository of data that we're all clear about and we all can use to improve instruction across the state. So that is really important to the work moving forward. The second guiding principle is about a menu of options, and actually the gentleman from Ernst & Young used that phrase, a menu of options. We need to be able to tell our schools and districts what is the menu of options? What are the things that DPI believe to be evidence-based practices that can improve instruction in their schools? And just so you know, we really started this work as far back as September. If you look at pages 10 through 13 of our ESSA plan, we have listed what we believe to be proven practices that are evidence-based that the department has been promoting as ways to improve instruction. So that would be a part of the menu of options. Next, a sense of clarity is an important guiding principle, providing clear expectations and reporting on the progress for these schools. The fourth guiding principle is maintaining some local control. Even though we are talking about a menu of options, we know that folks need to be able to select evidence-based practices based on their need. The next guiding principle has, of course, to always do with the alignment to state legislation and to our federal guidelines that, of course, we have to follow. And then the sixth and last guiding principle for the work that you will see today is about accountability for outputs. Again, we have to have actionable data that we can use in the department, whether we're going school by school, district by district, or in a regional system of providing supports that is actionable data that we all know, we understand, and we can provide services to improve. So those are the 6 guiding principles. We're very excited about this work. This is something very different than anything we've brought to you before that will certainly discuss how we do our work differently at the department to hopefully get a different result. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Ellerby, and he will take you through some of the exciting logic models and project management tools you have before you. And then I think we're breaking up into small groups.
Good evening, everyone. And I want to start by acknowledging again that this logic model was a collaboration with many units, and part of the logic model was also involved with some of our external stakeholders, such as the Innovative Project, TIP, who helped with reforms and the self-directed process, the flow chart that you will get to see a little bit later in this presentation. On the logic model, this is a series of innovative and accountable interventions. And we start by presenting the triangle that you got the information for a little bit earlier on the 3 levels of support from Educator Support Services. But I like to point to the first green bar, which is dealing with the recurring low-performing schools. So when you cross that bar, we have options for LEAs to choose a North Carolina reform model, which would be transformation, restart, turnaround, and school closure, or they may choose a district self-directed intervention. There is a component in there where we're really trying to highly recommend and emphasize a year of planning, because what we have found in some districts is that the urgency of writing the plan, they were not able to involve all the stakeholders. And so we want to ensure all stakeholders are involved in their plan so that it will help with the implementation. So we're encouraging the year of planning. With that, there's 3 years of implementation. So total for this reform model that a LEA may write for, then they will receive exactly 4 years to do the planning and as well as the implementation of their reform model or the self-directed intervention. If they are not meeting expectations based on the flow chart that we will show you in a few minutes, because the reform models and the self-directed, we have that flow chart to go into more detail so that you will get to see how that process rolls out. If they're not making and meeting expectations, then we want to drop to a level that calls mandates and monitoring. And mandates and monitoring, we have that section coming up in a few. So this is just an overview, just to let you know what is coming. That could be for 1 year, which now gives you 5 years to really turn around that school. Then, if expectations still are not met, then the physical reporting and the physical requirements, which deals with the federal fundings of these areas, could be used and to support these schools in turning around their initiative. That's another year. And then, as you can see, we are recommending that if we're following general statute and some of the things that we have in our other plans, that if they're not meeting those expectations, then they'll cross the bar, the second green bar, which is 4 to 6 years of a timeline to meet expectations. Then it can be referred to the board, and we'll talk more about what the board, the options that the board have to support, as well as the iZone and the ISD. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, thank you so much for going through this, because I'm beginning to wrap my head around it. That could be dangerous. Let me ask a question, not my final question, but a question. So let's just take the transformation model. That's correct. It's a model, right?
Right.
So would the services from DPI be the same for the transformation model as it would be the restart model?
The process will be the same, but the services may not be the same. And if we go through the flow chart, I think we'll be able to clear some of that up for you.
Okay.
Okay? Any more questions? I would like at this time, we have a team of educator support services folks who will come and serve as facilitators with the flow chart. Now, when you first see it, don't go, oh my, but it is a lot to take in at one time, but know that we're gonna walk you through it, and it does serve a purpose. And all that have worked with the flow chart, especially Tip, we've been able to really put down an example, a visual, to help us through our process and to close some of those gaps that Dr. Martin and Dr. Barber have talked about that we're trying to close. And
so originally we were going to try to do this in tables, but we're going to have you work right where you are, but we may have to sort of gather up a little bit closer. But the folks that are in the chairs are just facilitating the conversation. They're passing out a handout for you.
We've got some big sheets.
Gathering your input.
Got some big sheets of paper today.
How are you, Susan?
Oh, good, we've got the expert.
I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Jesus. Okay.
When you
I don't know.
Yes.
So, although it's very similar to the restart first, yellow would be right education would be okay. The blue represents ESS agency, all the things that are happening within the agency. Not just as well. And then the red is for the LEA. So you can see we're trying to make this so that LEA has control throughout the process. So if we start here, there's 3 phases. There's consideration for the 4% models. Everybody is kind of thinking it's on the restart, but there are actually 4, and then if you want to count the
RLPS is recurring low performing schools.
There's the reform implementation and reporting. They do 1 through 3.
So that's part of the 4 years?
Yes. Yes, that's the So if we do the considerations for the models, you'll see here is the student achievement results, and then you go down and you identify recurring low performing schools, and our agencies will be doing that work for you, which will give us direction. And of course, we'll notify the LEA which process. That is required by law on the state's website, and then we will host webinars to give them information. Additionally, we would facilitate some workshops and trainings on the reform models and be able to break out transformation. Then we'll do work in that. Then we'll restart, have a look at that after the overview is given. Then the LEA collaborates with all stakeholders, and this is a key part because some of the restart applications were written only not the schools, and so they were not sure how to implement that in the model. So we want to ensure all stakeholders are involved in the process.
Okay, I need to ask a question.
Yes, ma'am.
This is year 1. This is planning, but that's not part of the 4 years.
No, it's not a part, this part is not a part of it yet.
It's called planning?
It's identification stage.
Identification.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so our restart schools.
I think that would help
applications are
to
approved
lay out what these
by the
timepieces.
state board. Does their timeline for their planning year start at the time that their application is accepted, or, okay, okay.
They send a letter of intent so we can see how to align our resources from the different departments in order to say. And then we would send the letter of receipt. And that's receipt here. Now, this is where it goes
what you do
off
and
a
how
little
you
bit
do
as
it,
far as in 2
and we
directions.
support
The
you for that
LEA
process.
chooses fast track. If yes, they go down to yes.
It's like a heavy
However, I like to no longer because it will come back
school
to the
improvement
yes.
plan on steroids, but
But
you
if
don't
not,
have the flexibilities that the
so that they have
When it
time
says
to not only
district
put in a little short
self-directed,
application as they do, but they also
you
have a
and give you that
tentative schedule
flexibility for their planning.
and they submit that to us. We summarize the information and give all the applications to you as we normally do. And then you would take action.
I feel like it's a monopoly.
Then the LEA
Okay.
because if they're approved for their
As opposed to
so
the coaching
they start
process that
hosting
was
their
described
meetings with
in
their
Dr.
stakeholders
Henry's
and beginning their planning process according to the
It's
schedule.
not working. I understand, and I hurt.
And then we're planning on, it could be the accountability if they're using NC check-in, or it could be some coaching support if they're using ESS, or if they're using some things at federal programs, it could be so it's collective bargaining between all of them.
it is
Then the LEA
full-blown, step-by-step.
Okay, another question.
Sure.
So, there is no involvement with the State Board of Education during this identification period, except here.
You start the process, but I think
But everything is straight ahead.
right.
Okay,
But a lot of them are choosing
I know. I'm just looking for the yellow pieces.
No, and you don't have.
Probably missed something, I'm sorry. So this is somewhat,
No, I just want to, I was just wondering, okay, where are points where the State Board of Education needs to get involved, but I guess not.
Yeah, and I think with this process right here, this.
yes.
It's LEA work.
And all of this work, and so,
I got
you're
you.
coming in a little heavier on that.
We've created,
Okay.
And then the.
I mean, I don't want to, but
we've created
That's not my point.
Created a firm called
They finalized their plan.
Okay, what about Wake County's Renaissance
Okay, now
model?
planning.
Okay, yep, okay. So using local funds only and local support only. No additional support from DPI?
But they start off, you get a watch, but if you're not doing well. So we're just trying to put some process with their rights. All over.
So it's my assumption that probably the districts that are choosing or encouraging schools for self-directed intervention are those that have more resources. So my counties that are from, to the Virginia line, Warren County, they just choose, if they.
Got it, okay.
Yes.
Not doing the planning yet.
And then the LA implements the reform model, and of course, we provide monthly coaching and feedback.
Encourage them to do a planning here, but many times they just want to jump in
Depending on what the need is from the plan.
That's right, they got another year even before they meet to give a report and get to that watch list or no one.
Do we have any numbers around this, like how many schools cross?
So we have what, 500?
Patterns and trends of things that have been successful.
Okay, so I get this barrier in their findings.
And this becomes an information item for you.
And then choose one of these or this.
Report. They'll know the data sources that they need from.
Okay, well, that's what I'm asking. Who gets the green bar and the recurring?
And then if expectations.
Okay, help me. No, you, oh, please, you first. Oh, no, I insist.
No, mine's
Yeah, okay. So, in the difference between our transformation and our restart schools,
So there are 200 here.
threshold between the 75 schools that we were talking about with Dr. Arthur, within, okay, yes. So what, the transformation and the restart, where's that cutoff? Solely their choice?
Okay, so most artists, yes.
Same type of cycle.
And I'm looking at all
Give it to the board.
the
The information.
and I'm looking
If the expectations
Yes,
are met,
250
then they
schools.
continue on, they're recognized by the
Yes.
board, those different groups, whether it be a lunching, whether it be some kind of letter, or whatever it is. And then.
This is the area of
if
work
they
that
have
got
not,
consolidated.
They could be placed on the watch list or the warning list, and there's two there, because if
Yeah,
they make
I mean,
the
that's,
first.
here in the report today, from EY, and I'm thinking about district school transformation, I'm thinking about our talent pipeline, and then we have all that stuff. But we don't have,
Is when it gets kind of tricky.
but I'm looking at the numbers here.
Under 17 is restart and 2 transfer.
The summer evaluation report. So the qualitative is probably great. We started with in the beginning or
And I
quantitative.
think that's our
That data
project management process,
served as
about
a
a coaching
baseline.
process.
And we
But
want
I'm
to see
still looking at a lot of blue boxes
And
on
it
you.
is,
if they're
there's
not
a
meeting
lot.
those targets.
All of us
then,
feels
But if we
of
can use
course,
technology to help us
after you get a
with a
chance
lot
to
of mock
medically
track
we
things,
make
for example,
recommendations
we
to
can,
then also you'll
so
take
all of
action
them
on
have
it.
their.
We also
Then
know
met
that
expectations.
teacher
Then
quality
they could
is
do a
Missing
reset.
pieces that we don't
If they
their
have,
data,
if they met
fundamentally don't have enough
expectations,
teachers to make
tests
then they
automatically
receive a
uploaded
yes,
into
and
Esso.
the SPE
So that's,
This is a great exercise.
approved them
so all the
to
data will
continue
be there
Have
in
highly
the
qualified
process.
teachers to
Because otherwise,
go in there and then we can sustain them.
pulling it from here, putting it out here. So those are the kind of things that we still have to
If it's a
make this
reset,
work.
they may be
Technology
using
to
restart,
help us.
but they need to use turnaround because they need to change out leadership.
It's still a lot. It is
Classroom and all that. That would be contingent upon the 3 years of reporting that we've had, the recommendations that we made to
Okay, let me ask you another question. I don't know if I'm following this correctly, but a school, an LEA that's placed on the watch list and they go all in this direction, it looks like they could be placed on a watch list again.
Well, that was say, as your
Yeah, yeah.
because if you watch this,
What award next time?
But it could still be a watch list.
It is their first time.
if it's, yeah.
First time.
Teacher supports and
Well, I'm looking at this as a second time.
Well, I see in that.
teachers and those.
Say, yes, you are improving according to your report.
Well, LEA is placed on watch list.
Yes.
One, time one.
You're on that watch list.
One list.
Placed
Group who
on.
met it also end up there.
And they get a watch.
They
Okay.
would get a watch list.
Okay, this would be the first one for
Yes.
some. I got you. That's a little confusing. Because it looks as though it says, or LEA is placed on watch list,
What would you
or
recommend
warning. The first time.
Okay.
Second time, you need to maybe break the box down somewhat.
Okay.
Other districts that don't.
Ooh,
But Restart has, money.
So if you don't mind, look over at us some more since we gave you the overview. And then, send a recording to ask one of the board members to check.
Yes, yes.
When I first saw it, it definitely was, oh my. But you're right, it's clear, it's very clear. I mean, now that you've walked us through it, if, you know, we can go back and find out where somebody is, and we know that what happens next. It's very clear, and I love the color coordinated, so like Olivia said quickly, what do? We know there's the yellows when it comes to us. And
One thing that I found out, well, I mean, we know.
yes, I saw, right.
When it comes to our
Yes.
today, our younger teachers coming out.
I think maybe you need to
they're not
clarify,
going into
unless I'm missing it in my quick
going into
glancing, that the
thing
label
for 30
identification year,
They just are not going
the
to.
identification period.
What are the key
Then they're gonna go
actions
to
that
something
improve
else.
performance?
Because most of them
And
are
the other
away
question
from
is,
home anyway,
how
because
long
they're
does
out
that
adventuring
last?
anyway.
I mean, estimated
Where is
time.
That's
That's not part of the 4 years.
Right.
It's a career, they're not.
Stepped up.
Pretty much what happens.
Doctor,
It might be helpful to add some estimated time frames.
Okay, and what I didn't say is that
of our jobs,
would be some
but so
procedures
we're
Right,
that would specify
right.
those things.
which is more.
If you think it's more, put 60 days for
Well,
that process of hearing. Because we can do it just like we have the 2 month process. We can do something.
This all looks like process to me, except the boxes that talk about coaching. Seems like all of them that come before my committee all
So it looks like coaching is the step that would improve performance, and then what's our
Exactly.
capacity to coach?
Exactly.
Sounds like it's
That's
not
right.
very.
So,
me too,
yeah.
so
I mean, first of all, I think, do you think all of the districts are well aware of the different ones, or they go to Restart because they think that's the easy one or something?
Not only capacity, but what's the quality of our
Oh,
coaching?
yeah.
How good is it?
Yeah, I know.
Right.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Think about 25 districts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they kind of process it. That's why it's very important to provide that consistency.
Yes, that's good.
I am not going to go or
Places that.
So my, not so much about the layout of this, but do y'all have the staff to do all this?
That's the part. Even though they're figuring it out.
I know.
But see, the good thing about this is it's going to
They also
have
specifically
other
line
Okay.
all age groups.
Got
So
it.
this is not just educator support.
Right, okay.
So this is like your theory of action
Yes.
for
Yeah.
ESS.
Yeah.
I did have another.
So the
Schools
2 cycles around.
That's right. And that was different than before, all the same, and then just
That's right.
the amplitude is, that's not good.
From day 1 to theoretically 1, but that's
Because we've got to
it's about a 7-year.
all those schools don't like this. We've got to make it
And
clear,
really,
that's why
if
we
they
teach.
clear here, that
But
means that
also
they're
what
on the right
happens
track.
if
And we're just gonna kind of
a
monitor.
year,
Yeah.
We want to capture those things that
No,
they.
as a teacher, when I see anyone above 7 years, that'll be different from you, so I'm not gonna worry about it.
Right.
Well, here's your licensure, I'll go, sure. It's like, that's a 7-year plan, like, you have to be really stable. Last 7 years.
So during, let's say, these models will not change during a period, let's say during
7
a
years?
7-year window. So that I would see that maybe principals wondering about that. It's almost like that needs to be locked in stone.
Remember now.
Is that in statute? That the model pieces can't change on them midstream?
If it's working, keep it going. That's what you're.
And I guess my other question is, what makes transformation, what's it called? Transform, what makes that different than Restart?
Yeah.
I mean, I want to know how these models look. Okay.
As far as.
So that's what constitutes the model.
Yeah.
It has to do with like no, not as much flexibility.
So transformation here, let's say, such as your curriculum alignment with your formative assessments and things like that. That's what North Carolina is turnaround process, leadership, and 50% to counties, and then restart flexibility.
And then is that, well, you'll tell me, there's, now, school closure would not take 7 years.
No, it would not. They would only follow.
So this is, so almost closure would make all of this moot.
So we have like 75% of them and 25% of them move across the next one.
So many forms.
Like the ISD.
What are our expectations for the innovative district to take on?
some kinds of practices that are
Some discussion that needs to be had.
But they would have to go through this top level later. Okay.
All right, so once a school was doing good, they identified it in their restart or turnaround or whatever, and then that a principal leaves, so they leave every other year, and half the teachers are gone, is that school just called like a transformation school? So whoever, the new folks that come in have to follow that? Yeah.
How does this?
It totally, exactly. That's right.
Yeah, that's for sure.
that you've met your goals for that year.
No.
Part of our upcoming chores are to oh, so yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know.
Anymore. Like their vision.
And have them
would be
Exactly, and
is not
so when they're hired, the district's going to have to say, by the way, I'm hiring you for this turnaround school, or I'm hiring you for this restart model. You're in the and you're at this point, so you're in this. You're in this until.
Well, that's why policy gets, Gary Henry's point about we need to be thinking of policies around these low-performing schools, and that could be a policy issue. You know, if you are.
Okay, so thank you for your time in discussing the flow chart. I would like real quickly if we can have 2 to 3 things from each group that you want to give as feedback about the flow chart. And if we can, we have a group to volunteer, please.
I know.
That's what we did in Halifax County.
Well, mine's not on. Oh, they turned it on.
Thank you.
You're ready to start.
Thank you. Can we have a few moments to share out, please? Each group, 2 to 3 things that you would like to share as feedback.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We don't have any control when those contracts are approved. That they would
Any
be
feedback?
3 or 4 years of consistent leadership.
A picture's worth 1,000 words. You know, and this helps you kind of get all the pieces together. And the flow chart piece and what happens at various junctures was absolutely helpful. I have to think about it a little bit more.
Yes, Ms. Willoughby.
I think one of our questions was around that, hopefully small number of schools that go beyond the second green barrier, and what are our expectations of the innovative school district work, whether it's zone or work or whatever. And I don't expect an answer to that because I don't know that we know.
Yes, ma'am. We're going to continue with the presentation, so some of that might be addressed, but I'm going to work on the flow chart. Any other comments?
Our group talked about the recognition of those schools that are having successes along the way and making sure that we're highlighting them. And then I would add to that learning from them and what they're doing so that we may can replicate that.
Okay. All right. And so that we don't prolong the time. So let's say all of this stuff is kind of still not jiving or fitting together. So what happens if the reform efforts are not improving student achievement? This is where we wanted to talk about the mandates and the monitoring. If a school either opts or is in the category of dropping to mandates and monitoring, we wanted to provide some governance and oversight in these areas: academic standards, best instructional practices, curriculum, human capacity to include teacher quality, student assessments, formative assessments focused on that area, and school restructuring and organization. And I have another colleague, my boss, who's going to come and share the next phase.
So then we're to the stage where what happens if mandates and monitoring are not impacting student achievement. And before we move forward, I just want us to think about what the timeline is for this. We've now gone through a year of planning, 3 years of implementation, and a year of mandates and monitoring. So basically, we're now at 5 years potentially, and the school is still not improving student achievement. We move to then what we're calling fiscal requirements and reporting. And this is where we start talking about and holding schools accountable for their dollars and how they're spending those dollars so that we can ensure that what they're spending their money on are the things that are going to impact student achievement. So this is where we really talk about this sense of urgency for improvement. We look at state dollars, federal dollars, and local dollars and how they are spending those dollars and what programs or what practices and processes they're spending their money on to ensure that it really is impacting or should be impacting student achievement. This is also where we start talking about technical assistance as far as implementation, because one of the things we've learned over time is that you can buy every program that's out there, but if you're not implementing it with fidelity and you're not using data to drive your decisions about implementation and changing things that aren't working in the middle of the process, then you're not going to have the improvement. So really providing the technical assistance, the hands-on, to make sure that they're implementing what they're purchasing with fidelity, and it should be impacting student achievement. We also want to make sure that we're using evidence-based strategies. We're going to do this throughout, but this is where the reporting piece would come in, and holding the schools accountable for reporting to you what evidence-based strategies they're using in those schools while we provide that technical assistance to implementation. And then ultimately, you're looking closely at their accountability outcomes to find out, because in Esso, we're going to have data at the subgroup level, and we're really going to be able to hone in and help schools really focus on those areas that are creating a low performing status. At the end of this, we're now 6 years, potentially 6.5 years into reform and improvement. And when you think about a kindergarten, you've taken now a kindergarten student to the 5th grade, 6 years, and we don't have any improvement in student achievement. That moves us to what we're calling our most rigorous intervention. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Petrie Martin to talk to you a little bit about what that looks like.
So as we have talked about, now we've gone through steps in this process. And so we know that certainly the ISD and the I-zone models are certainly things that are being considered. We do know for the innovative school district, that's up to 5, and they are elementary schools specifically. We know that we have middle and high schools also who may be on that reoccurring low-performing list. So we will take some additional time in working with Dr. Hall to really think through what does that look like to have that be part of a rigorous intervention. But we also know that at the, I guess, farthest end of this rigorous intervention is this piece of statute that talks about the dismissal or removal of personnel and the appointment of an interim superintendent for a local school administrative unit. And then it also goes on to say in the event the state board has appointed an interim superintendent and the state board determines that the local board of education has failed to cooperate with the interim superintendent or has otherwise hindered the ability to improve student performance, the state board may suspend any of the powers and the duties of that local board of education. So we always want to make sure we share what is the most rigorous and intense level of intervention as we are certainly looking at supports. And one of the, I think, long-term visions that we have talked about in this building as a team is looking at exceptional school leaders from across the state who could be trained, we could certainly work through here the department, who could be deployed out into low-performing schools and low-performing districts to really initiate significant change. And actually, I told the team that has been a dream of mine for many years to have a group of just outstanding educational leaders from across our state who could be deployed to the most serious and intense situations that we have in our state. But again, that would be on the most intense and most rigorous side of intervention. So that targeted support for really high impact, we've talked about a lot of things today, but driving the successful realization of the state's vision and mission is at the heart of all of this, reinforcing the statutes and policies to leverage the highest impact with a focus on expertise, time, and resources. As I said in the small group, really looking at doing more project management of what folks are doing is critically important to this work, and honing in on evidence-based practices is critical. We've used that term several times. It's a term in our Esso plan. We know how to define it, and we need to make sure that schools are using it, evidence-based practices. Talking more about the ISD and what that would look like to have schools go into that rigorous intervention. The I-zone model, I know that Dr. Hall is continuing to work through what that looks like. And then the interim superintendent concept. Of course, it is in law that that could be initiated if needed, and then taking some of the powers away from local boards as needed. There's another thing that is in law that we have used many, many years ago, and that is the term a state turnaround team. That is something that has not been used in quite some time, but it is the same concept of really training and working with leaders to be deployed into schools to create significant change. And these are folks who are in the school regularly, daily, working with school and district staff. So these are all things that we need to continue to discuss. What does that look like? How do we implement those things? And really, our purpose for today was to give you some food for thought. We gave you some interesting documents to take a look at, to really show you how we're thinking step by step of what this process could look like. You had note takers sitting with each of your small groups. We're going to take those notes, certainly collect them, and bring back some additional information to you. But we're going to pause right now to see if there are any additional questions or comments. This is a different way of thinking about the work. Yes, ma'am.
I do have a question. I can't take my eyes off this chart. So I'm wondering, years 1 and 3, I'm at the top of info item in yellow, expectations met. I'm kind of at the third.
Yes.
And then we go, no, LEA is. About how much time takes place between an LEA being notified that you're on a watch list to the LEA revises reform model plan? Because depending on when this occurs, it could be in the middle of the year.
Absolutely. So in the summer, districts have preliminary data that is not approved by the board, so it's not final, and we understand that. But they do have a general idea of the progress that they've made. And so they can look at their plan and see if they've met the goals for that year. Because in that first year, it's an annual report. We, based on the information that you heard earlier from Dr. Henry, and just based on our own experience, we know that turnaround can take more than a year to impact student achievement, but they may have some qualitative aspects of their plan. So they would know that in the summer for that first year for an annual report. So as soon as we have that data in August, we would be able to notify them that they didn't meet the expectations of their first year on the annual report and they need to revise their plan. Same thing for the second year. It's the third year where it gets a little trickier, because the third year is when we're actually expecting to see significant impact on student achievement. That's going to be more in your October timeline. If they're not, then that's when the renewal for their reform model would come into place. So the watch list and the warning list, there's also a progress list or a recognition list. So if you are meeting your goals, we're going to recognize you for meeting your goals. But we also want you to know that we're checking in every year to make sure you are. And that the main thing is that you're changing your reform model plan to address where you didn't meet your goals. Because if we just keep doing it for 3 years, we're going to get the same results.
Thank you.
Any additional questions or comments? Okay, well, we will certainly take your feedback and continue to fine-tune this information and bring back to you additional information about next steps. Thank you.
Dr. Petrie Martin, are you going to debrief us some before we get out of here?
Yes, sir, it is about that time.
Yeah.
So I do want to let you all know that at the end of tomorrow, you will be asked to use your device. We will be using technology to have you respond to some questions based on the topics that we have covered today. For example, as we've talked about low-performing schools, we would love to hear from you about what supports that you would like to see to low-performing districts and schools based on everything that you've heard today, from Dr. Henry's presentation, from the presentation from the Educator Support Services. What are things that you would want to see? Also, based on the Whole Child NC pilot presentations that you will see tomorrow, we will also be asking a question about any recommendations that you might have based on the pilot information you'll receive. And then there are two other items that you'll hear tomorrow. One is on the NC check-ins and how schools are using that as an formative assessment tool to advance their learning, and then recommendations for school safety. So these are all areas that we will be asking you using technology to provide your feedback on as we end tomorrow. So that outlines what will happen tomorrow and how we will end our day tomorrow.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Petrie Martin. Before I entertain a motion to adjourn, is there anything else that anybody wants to bring up? Some of this is pretty deep for me, I'll tell you that.
Not by yourself.
I'm not by myself, okay. And Mr. Alan Duncan, welcome again.
Thank you.
This is not typical of a meeting.
Please come back tomorrow.
Come back tomorrow.
Number of uplifting topics.
Yeah. We're outlining a lot of problems that I'm sure you realize that exist, but it doesn't exist as much in Guilford County as it does in some of these poor rural counties. But I know you're dealing with the aftermath of a tornado, and we wish you well as you address that, and we're just glad you could make it. So with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Okay, motion to adjourn. Second. Second by Ms. White. All those in favor say aye. Anybody opposed, no. Motion is approved, and we stand adjourned until 9 o'clock tomorrow.